Again, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So, this past week, I was at one of my favorite cafes. I was at Aroma on Tahunga and Moore Park, sitting, reading, having a little latte, when I was disturbed from my reverie and my thoughts with the following phrase. I heard someone say, "It all depends on the ending. We've got to get the ending right." And this being Aroma, this being so close to all the studios, I looked up and I was not surprised to see that there were two men busily looking over a script, discussing back and forth how to bring to conclusion the project they were working on. And they were absolutely right. The end is essential. This is not just a technique of Hollywood, but this has been a truism for storytellers of all shapes and sizes and stripes throughout human history. Beginnings are important. You have to have something cohesive in the middle. But the end is essential. It is crucial for how people feel about and then will reflect on all that has gone on before. The Torah understood this lesson as well. And so, as we look at the various ends of the book of the Torah, we see that the Torah incorporated endings that were powerful and dramatic, that would leave its audience, if you will, either wanting more or being able to truly understand and reflect upon and hold on to the power of what came before it. And so we see at the end of the book of Genesis, a very dramatic end, Joseph's death and his burial in the land of Egypt, planting the seeds for the oppression that would follow in the very next chapter, in the very beginning of the book of Exodus. And the book of Exodus itself, also a very powerful ending, with the erection of the Mishkan and the clouds of glory descending upon and filling that Mishkan, thereby giving it God's imprinter and divine sanctification. The book of Leviticus, even though it technically ends on chapter 27, was a discussion of monetary values of various things, most scholars will say the real ending was chapter 26, the Tochecha, the rebuke. Very powerful and dramatic moment as well, reminding the Israelites of all the different mitzvot that they must observe and the rewards and punishments that will befall them if they but follow or do not follow God's way. And the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 34. Can it get any more powerful and poignant? We're just outside of the promised land. Moses dies. Al pi Adonai, by the word of, or as Rabbinic Midrash interprets it, by a divine kiss, and buried by God. And then there's the book of Numbers. And this ending puzzles us. For we see at the chapter 36, and if you wish, you can turn there. Chapter 36, beginning as it does on page 965, the very last chapter of the book of Numbers ends with a leader, actually several leaders of the tribe of Manasseh, the half of the tribe that did not say that it was going to stay on the other side of the Jordan, approaching Moses with a problem. See, in chapter 34, the land is all divided up. In chapter 35, we read about the cities of refuge that murderers who committed the act unintentionally flee to. And then here in chapter 36, Moses is approached and said, "Listen, it's not okay. This thing that you did for the daughters of Zelophehad, these 5 women, it's not okay. By giving them the right to inherit, if they marry outside of the tribe of Manasseh, our holdings will be reduced." A rather plebeian matter, would you not say? What an odd way to conclude the book of Numbers, to conclude any book. Hardly dramatic, hardly inspiring. And yet I would like to try to convince you this morning that it is utterly brilliant. And if not the most dramatic of endings, probably one of the most practical and useful that we see in the Bible and that we can accept into our own lives. Let me explain. In chapter 27 of the book of Numbers, begins page 925, we read about the aforementioned daughters of Zelophehad. These 5 women who approach Moses. They approach Moses and they say, listen, our father died because of his own sin, i.e. not the sins of the spies or that generation that rejected God and God's promise to deliver them into the land. Our father died of his own sin, and he left no sons to inherit his land. Why should his name disappear? As it says in verse 4, let not our father's name be lost to the clan just because he has no sons. And the Hebrew here, I think, is very interesting. Lama yigara shem avinu. Why should our father's name be diminished or decreased? Because he has no sons to inherit the land. And Moses brought their case before God. And again here the language is he. And the Lord said to Moses, the plea of Zelophehad's daughter is just. Ken banot Zelophehad dovrot. Ken, yes, it's right. Those words that they have offered up. And the law was changed. And from that point on, it was understood that a father's daughters could inherit in the absence of sons. Now, many in the liberal Jewish community look upon this text and they say, look at that. Look how progressive our Torah is. Look how right it is. Here affirming these women's right to inherit. How advanced, how wonderful. And it is true. It is quite progressive. It is quite an advancement relative to the societies of the time. However, lest we trumpet this text as an absolute affirmation of the absolute nature of women's rights, I remind you of what we started by talking about in chapter 36. For in chapter 36, we have those tribal elders of Manasseh come forward. And they come forward and they bring their case before Moses. And as I said, they have an issue as well. What happens if these women marry outside of the tribe? And again here, the language is very, very instructive. For it notes in verse... Let's see. In verse 3, it will begin. It'll say, now if they marry persons from another Israelite tribe, their share will be cut off from our ancestral portion and be added to the portion of the tribe which they marry. Thus our allotted portion will be yigareya. The same word will be diminished. And so here we have a problem. And the Torah articulates the problem using exactly the same words. The daughters of Zelophehad say, our father's name will be diminished. But the elders from the tribe of Manasseh say, our holding will be diminished. And to make matters worse, when Moses brings this to God, God says, this is what the Lord has commanded concerning the daughters of Zelophehad. They may marry anyone they wish, provided they marry into a clan of their fathers. God acknowledges it. And in the verse before even, he says, so Moses at the Lord's bidding instructed the Israelites, saying, the plea of the Josephite tribe is just. Looking at the words, it says, Ken mate b'nei Yosef dovrim. Ken, yes, those words are right in exactly the same language. in exactly the same language in which God acknowledged the rightness of the claim of the daughters of Zelophehad, so he does so for the tribe of Manasseh. And as I said, God resolves it. God resolves it by saying they may marry anyone they wish, provided they marry into their father's clan, their father's tribe. And in that resolution, we understand exactly why the Torah ends the book of Numbers this way. For what we have here are two claims, both of which are right. And the Torah acknowledges that and says so explicitly. Both the claims of the daughters of Zelophehad and the claims of the tribe of Manasseh are right. Ken dovrim, ken dovrot. God doesn't say one is right or the other is wrong. God doesn't say one is right and the other has an interesting point of view, which, okay, I think we can acknowledge and just kind of go along with, because, like, what else can we do? God says they are both right. They both have valid claims. They both have interests that are appropriate to protect. And in God's resolution, God forces each of them to give a little, to compromise. And thereby, their rightness is acknowledged, and unity and peace is preserved. As I said, this is not a dramatic ending. It's not a powerful ending. It's really quite boring when you think about it. And yet, it is brilliant. Because what the Torah understands, that in the wilderness of life, just as in the wilderness as the Israelites experienced it, life is complex. It's nuanced. It's varied. There are no absolute right claims to be made here. There are no boundaries that we can work within that provide neat and simple answers and solutions. People are called upon not just to tolerate the claims of the other, but to acknowledge that there can be things of completing right claims at the same time. And the challenge is to balance those claims. When we make an absolute claim to the correctness of our position, we become intolerant and intolerable. When we are so rigid in what we believe, we allow no space for the other. No relationship can work that way. No relationship can survive. When I meet with couples in the course of their getting married, in the course of that process, either in meetings with them or even on the day of the wedding, I always ask them one question at some point in time in my meetings with them. I always ask them, are you willing to make space in your soul for the other person? Because if they're not willing to make some space for them, not just to sort of kind of like acknowledge their humanity, but acknowledge their interests, acknowledge that they have claims that are correct and right and appropriate. If they're not willing to create some space for them, then that relationship cannot exist. Only if the borders of our souls are porous and allow space for the other can there be a real covenant between individuals and within a society. But when we are so certain as to the rightness of our claim, our borders become absolutely rigid and impenetrable. And that does not lead to a happy ending. On the contrary, what the book of Bamidbar, the book of the wilderness, teaches us is if we're to negotiate the wilds of life, and life is wild, we need to be willing to be right and acknowledge the other as being right at the same time. The Torah ends this book this way as a way of showing us that not only is, shall we say, in the parlance of this week, Not only is compromise not a dirty word, but arguably, if it's in our Torah, one can make the case that it is a holy and sacred one as well. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.